Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the most deadly prison uprising in U.S. history, and we're going to unravel the decades-long cover-up that followed it. We're looking at the events of September 1971 at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York. So let's get right into it.
To really grasp the gravity of this, we need to start with the devastating aftermath of September 13, 1971. This was a single day that left 39 people dead and a whole nation in absolute shock. To put that into perspective, an official commission later stated that, if you exclude the 19th century massacres of indigenous peoples, the state police assault that ended this four-day uprising was literally the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War.
Now, immediately following the violent end to this standoff, state officials and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller hit the media hard with a horrifying narrative. They came out and stated unequivocally that ruthless inmates had slit the throats of the hostages. This story of savage, cold-blooded murder just completely dominated the initial news cycle, painting a very, very specific picture for the American public.
But here's the twist. Less than 24 hours later, official medical examiners completely shattered that state-sanctioned narrative. Autopsies confirmed that every single hostage killed during the retaking of the prison actually died from bullets. Bullets fired by the state's own law enforcement officers. So the initial official story, it was a total fabrication.
Section 1. The Powder Keg, Systemic Conditions.
To understand how things reached such a horrific climax, and honestly, why that massive cover-up was even attempted, we really have to rewind and examine the daily reality inside Attica. The conditions were just incredibly bleak. The men inside were treated less like human beings and more like animals caged in a facility operating at nearly double its intended capacity. Think about that. A prison built for 1,200 men was holding 2,243. Inmates were locked in their cells for 14 to 16 hours a day. Their mail was heavily censored, medical care was a joke, and they faced just rampant, systemic racism on a daily basis.
And speaking of that racial tension, you have to look at the demographics. The incarcerated men were 54% African American, 37% white, and 9% Puerto Rican, and a lot of them came from urban centers like New York City. Yet, this entire population was overseen by a guard corps from the local rural area that was almost entirely white. It created this intense cultural and geographic clash. Guards would frequently just throw out mail written in Spanish and purposely relegate black prisoners to the lowest paid jobs. It was a recipe for daily racial harassment.
So you know, this wasn't just some spontaneous riot that happened out of nowhere. It was actually part of what researchers like anthropologist Orasami Burton call the Long Attica Revolt. These inmates were highly influenced by the Black Power movement and the New Left. A massive political catalyst happened in August 1971 when George Jackson, a really prominent Black Panther author, was killed by guards in California's San Quentin prison. His death was a shockwave. It prompted 700 Attica inmates to hold a silent hunger strike in his honor. They really saw themselves as part of a much broader revolutionary movement.
By mapping out the timeline, you can see the tension escalating systematically. In July, inmates sent 27 demands for basic reforms to the state, which were, of course, completely ignored. The warden actually responded by tightening restrictions even more. Then on September 8th, a misunderstanding during an altercation led to inmates being locked down. The very next morning, September 9th, there was a chaotic mix-up about which inmates were supposed to be confined to their cells. Panic set in. Thinking they were about to be severely punished, the inmates lashed out, and that was it. The fuse was finally lit.
Section 2. 4 days of negotiations.
What started as total chaos on the morning of September 9th actually evolved into a highly organized, super tense 4-day standoff. By noon, 1,281 men had taken control of half the prison. That included D-Yard, the network of tunnels, and the central command room, which they cleverly called Times Square. During the takeover, they took 42 officers and civilian employees hostage. But here is what's fascinating. Rather than descending into pure mob rule, the inmates organized. They elected leaders, set up medical stations, and even appointed their own security team to protect the hostages from more radical factions inside the yard.
They had some incredibly powerful orders speaking for them, like 21-year-old L.D. Barkley. Tragically, Barkley was actually just days away from his scheduled release. But his declaration to the media became the defining sentiment of the entire uprising. He told the world that they just wanted basic human dignity, to be recognized and treated as men, not beasts.
And they backed this up by drafting a really meticulous document known as the Attica Liberation Faction Manifesto. It contained 33 very specific demands, and when you read them,
They're asking for things that seem entirely basic today: better medical treatment, fair visitation rights without a mesh screen between you and your family, daily showers, toothbrushes, religious freedom, and an end to physical abuse. They even had the foresight to request an outside committee of observers, politicians and journalists, to come in and help negotiate. And it almost worked. State Corrections Commissioner Russell Oswald actually agreed to 28 of those 33 demands, but he drew a hard line in the sand on two things: removing the prison's warden and granting general amnesty from criminal prosecution for the takeover. The Observer Committee basically begged Governor Rockefeller to come down to the prison just to show some good faith in coolly escalating tensions, but Rockefeller point-blank refused to visit.
So the impasse hardened. The outside observers kept asking for more time to try and work out a formula for amnesty, but behind the scenes, the state was already secretly drawing up plans to retake the facility by force. Meanwhile, the inmates started digging defensive trenches and building barricades, bracing for an assault. You have to wonder, with negotiations totally stalled out and the governor refusing to arrive, was a violent clash just inevitable at this point?
Section 3. The violent retaken. That tipping point finally arrived on the morning of Monday, September 13th, and it brought an incredibly swift and brutally tragic end to the standoff. At 8:25 a.m., Commissioner Oswald delivered a statement directing inmates to release the hostages, but crucially, he didn't explicitly warn them that an armed assault was literally imminent. When the inmates refused, the state made its move. At 9:46 a.m., helicopters dropped tear gas right into the yard. Then, hundreds of state troopers, sheriffs, and correctional officers descended into the blinding smoke, just firing shotguns loaded with buckshot indiscriminately. By 10:05 a.m., the firing stopped. In less than 20 minutes, law enforcement had killed 9 hostages and 29 inmates.
But the violence didn't stop when the gunfire ceased. According to eyewitnesses and the doctors treating the survivors, the aftermath was just an absolute bloodbath. Prominent inmate leaders who had helped organize the demands, like L.D. Barkley and Sam Melville, were allegedly singled out and executed by troopers, even after they had surrendered with their hands in the air. Surviving inmates reported being stripped naked, forced to crawl through broken glass in their own latrines, and subjected to horrific, retaliatory physical and sexual abuse by the enraged guards and police.
Section 4. Exposing the cover-up. So, right after the massacre, the state goes into full damage control mode to conceal its own brutality, which brings us back to that false narrative we talked about at the beginning, the total lie that inmates had slit the hostages' throats. But over the following years, independent commissions slowly started piercing through the official lies. The Baquet Commission in 1972 heavily criticized Governor Rockefeller and the state police for their assault and for allowing those horrific reprisals against inmates afterward. Then, a few years later, the Meyer Report investigated the legal cover-up itself. They found massive omissions in evidence gathering that seemed deliberately designed to protect law enforcement from prosecution. A prosecutor who actually turned whistleblower alleged his own superiors actively blocked him from charging any law enforcement officers.
It took literally decades of fierce legal battles, but eventually the truth forced the state's hand. In the early 2000s, the state of New York paid out roughly $20 million in civil settlements. $8 million of that went to the surviving inmates who were tortured, and $12 million went to the surviving hostages and the families of the slain prison employees, people who had basically been left entirely unsupported by the very state that accidentally killed their loved ones.
Section 5. The systemic legacy.
The legacy of Attica forced the American penal system to take a hard look in the mirror. But the reflection we see in that mirror has shifted a lot over the decades. In the immediate aftermath, the uprising really did spark some basic improvements. Prisons introduced formal grievance procedures, allowed better medical care, and actually provided access to higher education. But then came the tough-on-crime decades of the 1980s and 90s, which deliberately rolled back a lot of these reforms. A massive blow was the 1994 Crime Bill, which eliminated Pell Grants for prisoners, effectively defunding prison university programs entirely. Today, a lot of facilities in New York are once again dealing with severe overcrowding and reports of guard impunity.
Which leads us with this really difficult final question. When we look at the penal system today, considering the rollback of educational programs and the ongoing, very real issues of overcrowding and racial disparities, we have to ask ourselves, did we truly learn the lessons of the Attica uprising? Or have we just allowed the exact same systemic conditions to fester all over again, simply waiting for history to tragically repeat itself? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning what you read and always keep seeking to understand the full picture.